Hi everybody, Tony Mandiel here from Anatomy FX. This coming May, I'm going to be doing a live presentation in New Jersey at Jackson Liberty High School to a group of film students. The presentation is going to be on doing simple blood gags and special effects for their films, and we're going to be shooting some video prior to that on how to prep the weapons to achieve these effects. So we're going to jump right in and get started. The first thing we're going to be doing is prepping a machete to do a slashed throat effect, sort of like Friday the 13th. Now, traditionally, the way we would do something like this is we would get a couple of real machetes, which we have here. Now, these have been dulled down on a grinder, so these are definitely not going to cut. The safety of the actors always comes first. And we would always have one intact. That's your hero prop. That's the prop that your killer is going to be carrying for all of his scenes. Prior to the victim getting their throat slashed, we would switch to something like this. Now, this is an exact same machete as our hero. Again, the blade's been dulled down on a grinder, but in this instance, we've cut a semicircle out of the blade. And the illusion is that when the killer holds it up to the victim's throat, it looks like it's cutting deep into their throat. The first time I became aware of this effect was in the 80s with Tom Savini on his Scream Greats video explaining how this effect was done. So this has been around since the 70s and 80s. I don't know if he pioneered it, but that's when I first became aware of it, and I've used it multiple times. Because we're going to be doing this demonstration at a high school, we will not be using the real machetes for the demonstration. As a matter of fact, I won't even be bringing them into the high school. Instead, what we're going to be using are these foam machetes that I picked up very inexpensively from Spirit Halloween. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Now, the first thing we need to do is determine the size and shape of the piece that needs to be cut out of our prop machete. So I have a female life cast here, and we're going to use something that's called a contour gauge. You can pick up from pretty much any hardware store. And this is for finding sort of complex shapes to cut out. So it's got all of these individual pieces that move to help you get your shape. So we're going to, you can hold this up to anybody's throat or any part of their body. It doesn't hurt. It moves pretty freely to kind of give an indication of the shape. So we're going to use this on this model's neck to figure out the basic shape of the cut that we want to make on our machete. So we've got a nice half circle there. And we're going to go ahead and trace this onto our machete blade to prepare it for the cut. Okay, we have our toy machete here from Spirit Halloween. And I'm not necessarily promoting Spirit at all, but they do have some pretty good quality foam weapons for the price. I think I paid about $12 or $13 for this. So, and we've got our contour gauge with the shape from the model's throat. So we're just going to go ahead and figure out where on our machete we want that cutout to be. And we're just going to trace it with a Sharpie. Now, I've never used these weapons before. I don't know what I'm going to find inside of it when I cut into it. I do know it's a dense foam, but I don't know if there's any kind of plastic that's running in there for added support. So we're going to find out together when I cut into it. So I'm going to use a utility knife with a fresh blade, and please be careful when you're using any sharp instruments. And we're going to start cutting. We're going to start with a score line. We're not going to try and cut all the way through. We're going to score it first to figure out what we're working with on the inside. And luckily it doesn't seem like there's any kind of plastic or any support in there that's gonna get in our way or cause any potential harm to our actor. Yeah, nice and easy. Easier than we could have hoped for. So I'm just going to even that up a little bit. And make a nice clean cut in our machete. So there's nothing in there that's going to potentially scratch our actor's skin. It's just a dense foam. This is as safe as can be. And you can see already it sells the effect of cutting into the skin. Now that we've got our section cut out of our machete, where our victim's throat is going to go, the next thing to do is start rigging it up with tubing for blood. So I've cut a length of 3/8 inch polyurethane tubing, about 24 inches long. This stuff can be a little bit difficult to manipulate. It is pretty stiff, and we want to glue it on at least one side of our machete as tightly to that curve that we cut out for our throat as possible. So what's going to happen is eventually we're going to pump blood through this tubing, and we want it to look like the blood is coming out of the victim's neck. So we need to hug that curve as tightly as possible. The best thing to do with this tubing is to hit it with a little bit of heat to manipulate it. So I'm going to heat one end of it with this heat gun to try and get it to follow that curve a little bit tightly. That's a lot softer and a lot more easy to manipulate. So now we can kind of hold it in place. Something to consider too before you do this is your killer right-handed or left-handed? And that'll determine which side of the machete to glue your tubing to. So if they're right-handed, assume they're going to be cutting this way, and this would be the underside of the machete that's going to be hidden from camera. If they're left-handed, it would be the other side. So something to consider. I'm going to work under the assumption that most people are right-handed, so we're going to glue it to what would be the underside for a right-handed killer. So for now, I'm just going to tack it in place with a little bit of hot glue. And then we're going to go ahead and secure it a little bit better once it's in place. Now, something I noticed almost immediately is the hot glue doesn't really want to bite into the smooth paint on the foam of this prop machete. I've never worked with these kinds of toys before, so you know, there's a lot of trial and error involved. So what I did was I took some 80 grit sandpaper and I just kind of roughed up the area that we're going to glue. To give the area a little bit of tooth for the glue to bite into. So we're going to go ahead and try this again, and we're going to tack down this tube as tightly to that curve as we can possibly get. And then once it's secure, we're going to go ahead and use a different kind of adhesive to hopefully make it permanent. Because the hot glue will pop off eventually, and the last thing you want when you've got your entire cast and crew standing around waiting for special effects is for something to go wrong and you have to hold everybody up to fix something. And it happens, but we try and minimize it as much as possible. We're just going to hold that in place until the glue cools, and then we're going to go ahead and finish gluing this tube along the length of the machete and down the handle. And then what we'll end up doing is we'll put a barb connector on the end of this tube. That way we can connect it to our pump, so the machete isn't always stuck connected to the whatever pump we're going to use to pump our blood. We can unhook the connector, and you know, the killer can walk around and not be tethered to whatever delivery system we're going to use for our blood. Okay, we have our tube glued, tacked down with hot glue along the edge of our cut and then down the length of the blade and the handle. It's just tacked on with hot glue, so it's not going to be a permanent adhesion, so we want to use a glue that's a little bit more long-lasting to make sure that this isn't going to pop off. That's purely experimental as to what glue is going to work best. I'm using JB Weld Quick because it happens to be what I have in the shop right now. Is it the best glue? I don't know, but it happens to be what I have on hand. So we're going to mix some of it up and we're going to run it along the entire length from the tube to the blade. Now, hopefully this gives us a much more sturdy and long-lasting bond. And make sure that you're really getting it on the weapon and on the tubing. We want a nice sturdy bond. Now that we've got some epoxy running the entire length of our weapon and our tubing, we're just going to set that aside to completely dry. We don't want to mess with this again until that glue is fully cured and it's nice strong bond. So we're just going to set that way off to the side. And we're going to start thinking about our blood delivery system. Now, the most economic thing you could use is go to any hardware store, Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace Hardware, and you're going to find a variety of different garden pumps. Here's a little $8 handheld one. And I think I probably paid about $11 or $12 for this gallon-sized one. These are just very run-of-the-mill, typical garden sprayers, and these are very low-cost item that you can use for pumping large quantities of blood. So we're going to go ahead and void our warranties and modify these so they connect to our blood tubing. Now that has a hose coming off of it that's attached to this wand that's meant to spray your fertilizer or pesticides or whatever you're going to use it for. We're going to take this wand off and we're just going to get rid of it. We don't need it. And our sprayer at the end of our hose has about a half-inch threaded attachment that wand is meant to go onto. So we're going to go ahead and modify this so it fits a barb that we can attach our blood tubing to. Now, when it comes to modifying these things, you're really at the mercy of whatever you can find at your local hardware store. This is a 1/4 inch male threaded end that's on the hose for this pump that I bought. And I was only able to find this 1/4 inch male threaded piece that's got the right size barb we're going to hook our blood tubing up to. And when I say barb, I mean this portion right here. So I had to get a 1/4 inch to 1/4 inch female adapter. That way we can get this to fit. So that's going to screw right on there. And then this will ultimately screw right on here, but we've got the problem of this needs to cut off so we can attach our brass piece. So we're going to go ahead and take a Dremel and Dremel this piece off so that it accommodates our customized piece. Now, if you're uncomfortable using power tools, you don't have to use a Dremel. You can use a little coping saw like this and start cutting through with just a little bit of elbow grease. As a matter of fact, we might not even need the Dremel. I think we're going to be able to cut right through this without breaking out the power tools. There we go. That's definitely going to void any warranty. And we don't even need the Dremel. So now, that'll accommodate our brass piece that we're going to attach with our barbs. Now, when you're going from a brass piece like this to, a piece of hardware like this, they're necessarily not going to line up. The thread count is a little bit different, but it's going to be okay for our purposes because we don't need to have a lot of pressure on it. We'll just give this a twist. And I'm going to grab a pair of pliers and make sure that that's really on there securely. There we go. That's not going anywhere. And now we've modified our garden sprayer to accommodate our blood tubing. So we'll be able to take our 3/8 inch tubing, heat it up, and attach it to this barb for our blood delivery system. Okay, now that we're done modifying our blood pump, and now that the epoxy adhesive has had enough time to fully cure on our weapon, so it's a nice strong bond now that's not going anywhere. The next thing we have to do is start putting holes in our tube where we want our blood to flow out. And then we need to plug up the very end. Right now there's a big 3/8 inch opening on the end of this tube. So if we were to pump blood through there, it would just flow out that end and it wouldn't sell the effect that we're trying to do. So we're going to plug that up and we're going to put some holes in there. Now what I found that works best for me, and everybody does this differently, is we want to start with gradually small holes that get larger. So if you see the blood flow angle there, we want our first hole to be smaller and then increasingly larger as we get towards the end of the tube. The reason being that if that first hole was too big, all of the blood would just flow out that one hole and would never reach the end of the tube. So it wouldn't look like there's an even flow of blood going down the entire wound. So we want a smaller hole that gradually gets larger as we get to the end. You can do this any way you want. Some people use an X-Acto to cut holes in the tube, but what I'm going to be using is a soldering iron, and I'm actually going to be melting holes in the tube. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we have a better angle on our weapon. As I was saying, I like to start with smaller holes at the beginning of the blood flow, increasingly larger as we get towards the end. That way we know that our blood is going to flow through every hole that we put in it and not just the first one. And also we're going to plug this up. We're just going to use a little bit of hot glue in there to plug that end up. That's going to be a nice strong fit. And then again, you could use an X-Acto knife to cut your holes, but I'm going to use a soldering iron and I'm actually going to melt my holes in my tube. I wouldn't recommend that unless you've got a adequately ventilated place. We have a huge 17,000 square foot shop here with 24-foot high ceilings, so we've got plenty of ventilation to melt our plastic. So I'm going to take this soldering iron and I'm going to start melting holes in our tube that our blood is going to flow through. And you'll notice that I'm doing it at an angle where the blood would actually be flowing against the actor's neck. You don't want to do it underneath, or you don't want to do it towards the back, because then it's just going to look like the blood is flowing down. You want the blood to actually flow out and against your actor's neck, so it looks like the blood is coming from their wound. So you want to do it closer to this edge. That way when the blood flows, it's flowing and hitting the actor's neck, and it sells the illusion of the blood coming from the wound and not the tubing. So there we are. We've got a couple of smaller holes. As the blood flows, it's going to hit these holes and it's going to bleed out, but it's going to keep enough pressure where the blood will be able to get to the last hole as well. So we should have an even flow throughout the entire tube along the actor's neck. Now I'm going to go ahead and plug up that end with some hot glue, and that's going to be enough to give us a nice tight seal. We're just going to let that cool. And then if we need to, we can go and add a little bit more. Okay, so we let the hot glue at the end of our tube cool. So that's a nice tight seal right now. And we went ahead and took an X-Acto and cleaned up any excess melted plastic from around the edge of these holes. So we should have some nice blood flow coming out of these holes now when we're ready to go ahead and pump our blood. And again, it's against the actor's neck. So the blood won't be flowing straight down and it won't be flowing out. It should be flowing towards the actor. That way it hits the neck and it looks like it's bleeding out from the actor and not bleeding out from the weapon. So the next thing we're going to go do is put a barb connector on the end of our hose for the machete, and then we'll be ready to connect it to our blood pump. So again, sometimes you're at the mercy of what your hardware store has. My hardware store only had the brass 3/8 inch to 3/8 inch connectors. If you can find the plastic nylon ones, they're a little bit cheaper and they work just as effectively. And in fact, probably a little bit better because they're lighter. This adds a little bit of weight to the end of the tube, but that's okay. Sometimes you just have to work with what you have. We're gonna go ahead and plug in our heat gun. And we're gonna heat the end of this tube just enough to get the barb connector on there. And there we go. Once that tube cools again, this isn't going to be going anywhere, and it's not going to leak. It's going to be a nice tight fit, and it's going to allow for enough blood pressure to flow through the tube out the end of our weapon. Now, repeating the process of connecting the tubing to the barbed connector, I cut another piece of the tubing and connected it to the barb connector on the end of the machete and the barb connector on the end of our garden sprayer. Now this is a step that you usually don't want to do until you get to set and you see the blocking of the scene. You don't know the position of the actors, you don't know your position as the effects technician, where you're going to potentially hide to be out of the shot. So it's the kind of thing where everybody needs to work in unison and really be on their game to make sure that everybody understands what's going on in the scene. I filled the garden sprayer with water. We're going to test it with water before we put any blood in it. And I've pumped it up to build up pressure. Now what you do is you fill your blood, or in this case water, into the pump, and then the more pumps you give it, the more pressure you're going to build up inside of there. So we're going to go ahead and take this outside and just see how our water flow is to the end of our machete. Okay, we're right in the back of the shop. That way I don't make a mess on the shop floor. We've got our machete that we've glued our tube to, and we've put our holes in it. We've connected it to this barb, which is connected to another piece of tube, which is connected to our garden sprayer full of water. I'm not actually going to hold this up to my throat because I don't feel like getting wet, but your killer would hold this up against your actor's throat, and, you know, depending on the action given by the director, use a sawing motion, whatever, and then you would hit the blood flow on your pump. So we should get a decent amount of blood flow through our tubing. Now, a lot of that's going to depend on the consistency of your blood. That's a lot of experiment, trial and error, but this is a successful piece, and you can see what the backside looks like. Imagine that with blood flow. Now, when we do this again, we'll do it with blood and with an actor, so we can test the entire thing beginning to end and make sure it works. But I would call this a successful build with our foam Spirit Halloween weapon. And you can go ahead and shoot an actual little movie with this and create a really effective murder scene. So thank you very much. The next thing that we're going to be doing is modifying a hatchet, and then we'll be modifying a straight razor, and then we'll be doing a build on how to do gunshots with compressed air. So thanks for watching. So the next effect we're going to do is we're going to test our prop machete. So we've got a hero machete here, and then we've got our special effects machete. So the idea is if you're shooting a scene editorially, you want to establish your hero machete with your killer, and then ideally you would go to a cutaway, and then you would have the prop machete already in your victim's throat and bleeding. So this whole thing is hooked up to a garden sprayer, and we've got the garden sprayer full of blood, and we're pumping air pressure, and the more you pump, the more pressure you're going to get. So hopefully we'll get a really good blood flow on our next victim.
We're rolling.
So here we go. So our machete fits right up against our victim's throat, and I'm going to jiggle it back and forth and go ahead and pump blood. And I think that's a good example. We can go ahead and stop. Yep. I'll put that right down there. Let me get you some paper towels.
Cool.